Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing. With your hosts, Mercedes Pollmeyer and Katja Dev. Okay, we are back with another episode with Steve Bechtel. And today we're going to be talking about performance. And I think that this is probably the epitome of why we're talking about training, the aspect that we want to actually be gaining out of everything that we're doing. Like, why are we even talking about training? Because we want to perform. So I think performance is pretty self-explanatory, but I think it can still be very confusing about what performance can be. I think our expectations as athletes to continuously perform through the year, I think, is a hot topic anyway that I talk about with my athletes, and I'm excited to hear about what Steve says. So yeah, Steve is here. Hello, Steve.
Hey,
Hey.
yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think that that's probably a good framework for us to work through in this conversation is that most people's ideas about performance are kind of polarized, even though they may not actually think that. And so there's a group of people that always want to be performing. I always want to be doing my very, very best. And every time I go to the crag, I'm projecting. And every time I'm bouldering, I'm going to my limit. And every time I'm in the gym, I'm going hard. And then on the other end are the people that are constantly preparing. Like, I'm not quite there yet. I'm getting ready. I'm going to just do a volume day to day. I'm going to take it, easy at the crag because I'm still training and I want to continue to develop my finger strength through the whole training season. And so there's the always training people and then the always performing people. And I don't think that absolutely everybody is polarized in that way, but we tend to fall to one of those camps. And both of those camps are traps when it comes to absolute best performances outside or in competition. When we want to perform, and that's when we are doing our very best at the sport in a place that it really matters. We need to make sure that the training all runs up to a performance phase, and then we perform. We can't be on either end of that continuum.
Yeah, and I think in competition, it makes a lot of sense that we're training and designing our training plans around this competition that we're going to do. And I think for the average climber, that's a little bit more complicated for them because it is more of a lifestyle. Sometimes plans change, and for them, performance is maybe going outside to a specific climbing crag. Could be for a couple days. It could be for a month that they're at this crag. And so to me, it almost seems a little bit more complicated to program for someone who doesn't actually have a set event like a competition.
Yeah.
Um, and so I do want to kind of talk about like a recreational climber who's really stoked, maybe at a more of a advanced level. Let's start there. Like if they're training for outdoor climbing, how many times a year do you think an advanced climber could actually peak, and try to do this in 1 year? How many cycles would they be able to
Yeah.
do?
Well, in the programming part of the podcast, we talked about this off-season time and then preseason, in season, and we can. There are lots of names for all of those cycles, whether you're using the traditional periodization names or whatever. But if we prepare well and we develop a lot of strength and power in the off season when we're primarily in the gym, then a very low level of maintenance is going to let me have an extended peak. And the extended peak is I think that it's interesting because much of our research into peaking is around running or weightlifting, where people will get ready for one marathon and they run everything up to do that one event on a Saturday in May, or they're training for one specific heavy weightlifting meet. And what happens is in climbing, because it's so skill based, the physiological variables like endurance and strength aren't as important. And so we can't, like having them come up to a really sharp peak isn't nearly as important. And so we want to build this level that we can call strong enough or fit enough for performance, and then get out there and perform. And I think that you could have two big long phases of 3 to 4 months per year that you're capable of best ever performances, as long as we do the supporting training in between. And so that includes strength and power in the off season, and then specific conditioning going into the in season. And so I'm going to do, if it's short routes, I'm going to build the conditioning for that. If it's longer routes, I'm going to build up some more aerobic style endurance. But whatever it is, I'm going to transition in and then maintain it. Maybe if I'm a weekend warrior, I'm going to maintain with 1 or 2 short workouts a week, and then really hit it hard on the weekend for my whole performance phase. And then when the performance phase ends, you know it, you start to get fatigued or weak or tired or whatever. Then we switch into an off-season period, get strong and powerful again, and then do the whole thing over again. And I think most athletes can have 2 big periods of the year. Most of my athletes are a big spring season and then a big fall season. And it really depends on where you live and what the conditions are best for.
Yeah. Well, I think that's nice and concrete. And it makes a lot of sense when it comes to the training programs and the science behind that. I'm just looking at my notes here. So basically, it was great. Some things came up there, so I have some follow-up questions. The first is a performance phase. We put expectations on that performance phase, and so I'm sure performance and goal setting, they go hand in hand. And when we're going into a performance phase, we might have these expectations that we're going to be maybe even jumping a grade. Or it could also be, like sending a project within a couple days. And I think being able to keep your expectations in check during a performance phase is really important. And did you actually match the training to like the expectations of the performance that you want? How do you talk to your athletes about expectations during a performance phase or as they're slowly ramping up for their performance?
Well, there's some really, I mean, there's good research on goal setting and the useful styles of goals. And there's actually a really good recent paper that came out that talked about the effectiveness, the long-term athletic development that results from certain types of goals. And so really the effectiveness of our performance is dependent on the goal type that we set. A performance goal, like I want to send 13A, is not as effective as a process goal of I want to show up at the gym regularly. I want to continue to push my comfort zone, and I want to try to develop some specific strength in these areas. And so the performance goal is an outcome, and we want that outcome. But the way we get those outcomes is making sure that we're filling in the blanks on the way there. And so making sure that when my athlete is headed toward a performance period, that athlete is thinking in terms of I want to climb better than I have in the past. And that might be not taking when I'm afraid, or trying risky or unlikely moves in the gym. Risk being the not necessarily dangerous, but out of control. And what we want with these athletes is for them to continue to improve the way they behave out there, and then the performances will come along. The problem is if I go, oh, I want to send 13A, and so I need to go find the easiest one in the whole world. I'm going to go look on 8A and find the one that the most people have sent at the softest area, and I'm going to go figure out how to make the process as easy as possible by top roping it and putting on long slings and really doing everything I can to make it easier for me. That is going to not lead me to consistent high level of performance. And so if I go, what are the behaviors that I have that are limiting me, and that have resulted in poor performance phases in the past, like spending too much time on a top rope, focusing on building endurance rather than getting less afraid. All of the sorts of things that a better climber or a higher performing climber would do. That's what I need to try to aim towards. So it's the process goals of training, the behaviors, the minute behaviors of training that then lead me the right direction. And so even if you don't send a harder grade, but your behaviors at the crag, your tactics, your run up to the performance phase is better behaviors and better practices will follow. And that's a hard conversation because we want the result way more than we want to have the actual thing happen.
Yeah. And I think it's really, again, it's so easy to want to have a specific outcome when you're in a performance phase. And then if you get a first sign, even on that first day, that you're not really even close to achieving that, it can ruin your whole trip or your whole performance phase. And I think focusing on the process goals, and even just like, I like focusing on wins for every day, especially if it was not a great performance day. Having some of those wins each day kind of helps you show up even better the next day. Um, and I think that's also something to remember is this, like, we don't always have control over how our body shows up each day. I think we try to control so much in our training. Like we think we're trying to control all of these elements. And then by the time performance comes, we should be able to do this. We should be able to do that. But in reality, the body is different every day. Uh, so yeah, I think the process is fundamental.
Uh, we might have talked about this, Mercedes, but one of the things that's important to me is noting any behavior that in bouldering, in the weight room, whatever, at the crag, that I'm proud of, like when I felt like I leveled up. Like for me, going for it on a hard move on a boulder, or pushing out one last hard rep, or going for a move at the crag when I'm facing a longer fall. I want to note those, and I want to try to adapt my training to have more of those. Like I just put a little star by them in my training log, and I want to have more of those per month or per training phase than I did previously. Things where I'm proud of the efforts that I made, or I really went for it. And so that's a big aspect of the psychological game of winning,
Mm.
and I think that all sets us up to this cascade of later performance, even if I don't get that specific grade this next training phase.
I think that brings up something I'm thinking about from a post I saw of Juliet Hammer, um, where she was on a boulder problem and had done most of the moves in a session, and then came back to it a couple weeks later and actually regressed in quotation marks. Like she was only able to do the first couple moves. And so in this post, she talked about like her performance that day was actually above and beyond what she normally would be able to do. And so she kept comparing herself to that one day of performance where, oh, she just wasn't good enough. She wasn't as strong. Something's going on. But actually, she had a fantastic performance day that day. And then when she went back the consecutive days, she was kind of like back to baseline. And that's something to remember too, is that we can't always expect to perform at a high level all the time. And this actually comes from you, Steve, like where, we're going to have mostly moderate, like just okay days. And I think, like that's when you can really like put down your
Yeah.
wins, the things that you were really proud of doing. And then you're going to have some really horrible days. And you're also just going to have a few really good days.
Yeah.
Um, and so like right now I'm talking about performance, like just generally, like some days we might feel really, really good and then expect to show up the same way, maybe the next time we go to the gym. And I don't know, that's mentally very difficult, I think, for people to accept, that fluctuations happen. And they're trying to hold on to like that high performance day, and like, how do I get back to that?
Totally. Well, and it's like it's so great to have personal best performances. But it's not the new normal. We're just pulling that average up, and that's exactly what you're talking about. And so I think that's the thing is like, we're looking at that long-term average, and I do like that inclining saw blade of things. Like I'm slowly getting better at this. But if you were trying for max pull-ups, whatever, all of that is a really critical aspect of the mental side of forward, but not linear forward. And so that is really tough. And there's so many factors at play. We talked about this in the recovery podcast, where like you could just be having a stressful time at work. You could be having a relationship strain. You could have your dog could be sick, and all of these things will add up to affect your overall performance. And that's what's so amazing about athletes that perform well consistently. You're like, whoa, I mean, they really can work through these stresses and manage the things in their lives. And so that's it. It's a whole nother aspect to performance. But what that is it's like managing the whole of your stress and recovery. It's almost like if you eat enough and you sleep well, performance will probably follow no matter what, as long as there's like no crazy stress and you're consistent in showing up for any kind of normal activity. And then when we step beyond that and we go, oh, I want to really get good at this boulder or whatever, then all that stuff, everything kind of expands from there. And so you have to be more careful with your stress, more careful with your sleep, making sure you're eating even better. And so all that stuff is really challenging, and it's part of the beauty of high performance in sport.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's the soft stuff, like the soft skills that we don't often talk about when we are creating training plans, or like when maybe the self-coach climber is creating training plans based off the information that we're giving them. All of that other stuff really needs to be taken into account. And yeah, it's focusing on some of the mental stuff that is actually a little harder as well,
Yeah.
because like if you do go into a performance couple weeks at a crag and you haven't focused on any of that mental stuff, then you're definitely most likely not going to perform,
Yeah.
very well at all.
Well, and the underlying thing, this theme we keep coming back to, is consistency. And I've had athletes go, oh man, I try as I might, I can't follow a training plan exactly. And that, like, I would say a 80% adherence to a plan is pretty good. And I don't want to give somebody an out, but the thing is like, maybe you only had 50 minutes to train instead of an hour. Maybe you had a 2-day period that you had some friends in town and you didn't go to the gym consistently. But if we can stick with that 80% consistency range, most people are going to get a very positive result from a training program. If you're really missing it and you get, off the rails for, 5 to 7 days in a row, you're doing completely different exercises and things like that, then you can't expect positive results. And it's funny because I think that unless you actually pay attention to your compliance or your adherence to a plan, you may not know where you are on that. And most people that think they're doing really, really well on a plan probably are in about that 75 to 85% range. But some people, are way off. They're like 20%, and at that point, you should expect really terrible results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I love that 80% rule. That's definitely something I follow for all aspects of life. So same with
Yeah.
nutrition. Yeah. Um,
Well,
Yeah.
Imagine like nutrition is so complicated, but if you said 8 out of 10 things that go in my mouth are good for me, that would be a really um, great diet. You know, you go, I'm going to eat this vegetable, this fruit, this piece of lean protein, these beans, and then, the ninth thing I eat is going to be a handful of salty popcorn. Great, because then you're right back into it, and so it is a matter of paying attention to what you actually did and trying to stay pretty close to the lanes and just understanding that very rarely do we see people that can comply completely. And
Mhm.
people that have really good compliance are probably lonely. They don't have
Mhm.
other people in their lives to help them
Mhm.
derail their schedule.
Yeah, I think there is that other extreme, or they're professional athletes. And we know
Yeah.
that people like professional athletes don't last that long. Like at some stage, they have to quit the sport. And then what happens to their life? Like, they have to return to something normal. And man, they get a real, like a reality check. Yeah, that's tough. So I think the 80% rule just across the board helps you live life and also like get better at the thing that you want to get better at.
Yeah.
Um yeah, sorry. Can we talk about folks maybe who don't go outside very often?
Yeah.
Maybe they only have one trip a year. Do you think it's important for them to go through a performance phase even if they're not going to go outside? Like maybe they're stuck at the gym. Um, you know, I know what you're gonna say, but I'm really curious, especially for folks, let's say, maybe they did plan to go outside, something happened, now they're not going. Should they do the performance phase in the gym?
Yes. Yeah. The performance phase is so important because it's what we are aiming toward. And I've seen athletes that just like become a campus board athlete or become a hangboard athlete where they've actually left the sport and they now prepare. I've gotten, so into this part of the training that now I think that that's where my thrill is. That's okay. But most of us really do want to still be better at climbing. And so, yeah, when you've been building up and you've ramped up the seasonal stuff, and here we go, and then something happens, or if you just don't leave, I still think you should have at least a month-long period that you're doing maintenance level strength and maybe one time a week. And then the rest of your climbing should be, what can I do here? It should be trying to on-site new boulders that have just been set at the gym, trying to set a personal best on the spray walls at the gym. It can be any number of things that are performance oriented, but your whole session is about integrating the whole of climbing and doing the best that you possibly can. It's not going to be like, let me see if I can eke out just a little bit more with my 3-finger drag. It's all going to be integrative. It's going to be full climbing stuff, and it can be sending routes to the gym. One of the things that's great if you live in a fairly urban environment, the Front Range, the Utah area, the East Coast, is to go on a climbing trip. Like go to another gym and try to on-site a bunch of boulders there. Go to some comps. Go do something that requires you to be a rock climber. And that cures the what we would call the right end of our scale, or I guess it's the left if you're looking at me from the screen. But anyway, the people that are always training and always still just preparing and preparing and preparing, because we can have an eternal up ramp of those things if we're not careful. And so we do want to get in there and just go for it and have fun. And that's one of the things I think is really key to then coming back into training fresh, is that we gave ourselves a break from the grind, and so it is really critical.
Yeah, and it sounds like that even if you're not going to go outside at all, we do have a pretty large population of folks who like to train, who are excited about getting better, and only climb in a gym, that you should also maybe plan for a performance phase. If the crag is your gym, and that's
Yeah.
also okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what about the other side? Like you did bring it up where the people who live close to to outdoors, like for me, I started climbing in Colorado. I had easy access to outdoor climbing within 20 minutes. I was bouldering outside and I could get on some really hard stuff. And I ended up basically trying to perform every weekend. Um, and I do notice that with athletes who have that easy access where it's like, oh, I'm going to be able to go outside. The weather is okay. I'm going to try to go out every weekend. What do you like? How do you balance this, like really like the stoke to go outside and perform with being able to prepare somewhat for a performance phase? Like how do you prepare them mentally for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's part of the dream. Lots of people are like, "Oh, I just want to get a van and I just want to go live the climbing life." But the ugly back story behind that is that if you just are out living in a van, camping and climbing at the crag, you're probably missing out on some of the fundamental building blocks of high performance. And that's great. You can go out there and, like I said, always be performing at a certain level. Like you can probably go out and climb V5 consistently across the year, traveling around area to area. But what about V6? What about V7? Why am I not getting a little bit better? And I think that's where I end up interfacing with a lot of these climbers is they're like, I have been climbing consistently for 18 months. I've been traveling to the hotspot bouldering areas. Why am I stuck? I thought this was the key. And really, it is like, got to spend the time building up the durability and the specific strength and power. And the performance environment isn't always the best place to do that. I mean, you could just, like, if we took an analogy, we said, look at American football. Like, football is terrible training for football. If all they did was go out on the field and run into each other and throw the ball and sprint and tackle, they would all be just injured all the time. And so they build strength and conditioning into their practice, and then they can go out there and perform. And that's similar to bouldering, especially bouldering over sport climbing, is it can be so damaging if we aren't doing the antagonist work, the mobility work, the conditioning work. And so I think it's really critical that those people take a break from the road, find a home base for those small builds of strength and conditioning. Even if it's for 6 or 8 weeks, twice a year, stop in, go stay at your parents' house, get a membership to the gym near their place, and build that strength back up so then you can go out and perform. But doing too much of just living the road lifestyle isn't going to show you your optimum performance gains. And you're going to always have somebody that disagrees. And they're like, I've been out here forever. I'm climbing really, really great. Look at such and such climber. They're just on the road all the time. Look how awesome they are. But when you actually get to talk to those climbers, when you talk to, full-time, hardcore professional climber, and they come and talk to me about training, they're like, I've been climbing out here for a year and a half, and I'm still not where I feel like I could be. And they're exactly right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what's interesting is some athletes will hold themselves back even if they are training, but they're still going out on the weekends.
Mhm.
Like if they know, well, I'm going to go outside this weekend, and they'll adjust the training so that they don't get fatigued or tired. And I used to run circuits at some climbing gyms in Denver, and I would actually have athletes say, "Hey, I don't want to do this weight because I don't want to be sore for my project this weekend." Um, and this was like in the summer,
Yeah.
when it's not even, performance temps. And so I think it's important that if you are someone going out on the weekends, that what stories are you telling yourself in the training? Like, are you changing the training? Are you showing up 100% and trying really hard, or are you holding back because you want to climb this weekend?
Yeah.
And I think also adjusting, like some of my athletes, I'm curious what you would say to them, but folks who can climb outside on the weekends or even during the week, we actually use that as part of their training, but we focus more on capacity or anti-style. I find there's like a huge bang for your buck working on things that you're really not good at in
Yeah.
these certain areas. Um, and that's not all the time, but there's definitely like maybe 6-week phases where we use the outdoors in that
Yeah.
respect.
No, I think that's important. And even if they can just articulate that this is off season, it's not a performance phase, it's a strength building phase. And then you say, what's the priority then? It's to build strength. And how do I build strength most effectively? I optimize for my gym training. And then outside, I can go do anti-style stuff. I can check out new projects. I can do capacity, but I'm not red pointing. I'm not trying to recover for that, just like you're saying. And then
Mhm.
in season, it's the same thing. My priority becomes red pointing or sending. Everything is built around that. And so then I have to be real careful when I put in my maintenance level strength. Like, how do I put that in so I don't make myself sore? But that's only
Mhm.
during your in-season phase. Now, if I'm going to give you 8 months of the year to perform really well and to defocus indoor training, I think that's a pretty good trade, especially considering like the marathoner who only gets to perform once or twice a year. We get 8 months of high performance. For many of us, some of us can get a little bit more than that, but we need to pay for that with 3 to 4 months of base building and strength focus when we can't be thinking about red pointing.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, let's transition to actually like talking about the performance phase. Um, what are some, I guess, strategies to maintain strength, or at least let strength kind of run in the background during a performance phase?
Yeah, so the first thing I consider when I'm having an athlete transition into a performance phase is what's their work capacity coming into this phase. We don't want to go from just doing 3 60-minute workouts through the winter to spending 4 days a week, full sport days at the crag, because they just aren't going to have the capacity for it. It's going to take many, many weeks for them to adapt. And so in that run up, we want to make sure that our gym time is getting longer. We're doing more days in a row. Really, what we're trying to do in the preseason, like after our strength and power building phase, is to adapt that athlete's physiology to being in a performance phase. For example, I sometimes will send climbers or train climbers that are going to Europe, and they're going to a crag that they maybe have never been to a project that they only know about from watching video, and they're going to be there for 3 weeks and really try to send a super hard climb. We want to make sure that they are as prepared as possible. So we research what is the approach like, what's the altitude like, how long are the routes, how long does it take a person to climb, how many effective tries is this person looking like they're going to get. And if they've only got 3 weeks for this trip, we really try to run that capacity up to where they can get one more good try in a day, because in a 3 week trip they might only get 6 or 7 good climbing days on that project. And so we want to make the most out of those things. So we try to really ramp that athlete up to what's needed in the performance phase. And then once that performance phase comes, we need to stay true to that and maintain that capacity. Like, say my desired capacity is to be able to do 7 pitches in a day, and that includes 2 warm-ups and 4 really good tries on a project, and then one cool down pitch. Even if I'm not doing my hardest climbing, I still need to try to keep that 7 pitches up. And so early in the phase, I maybe can only get 2 good tries. Well, I need to keep that capacity going, because later in the phase, as I get better and better and better, I don't want to have to rebuild that endurance. And so we want to maintain that. We also want to think about the basic values of general finger strength, general upper body strength, core tension, and make sure that we maintain those. And we can generally maintain those with about a third of the work that we normally would have done. So that might be 1 day a week for half as many sets as we were doing when we were building that strength. If I was in the strength phase and I was doing 3 days a week and banging really hard, I can really, really back off and then just try to keep those numbers and pay attention to the values and making sure that you can still do weighted pull-ups or finger strength at this given number, but the volume can really drop off. If the strength starts to taper, we need a little bit more volume of it, but we don't need to keep, we don't need to go back into a strength building phase. We just want to hang on to it. And it can drop off 10 or 12% and we're okay. But what happens typically without in-season training at all is a big drop off in strength and conditioning. And then all we have is this person that needs 4 days between burns at the crag, and their injury risk goes up, their work capacity goes down. And so 1 day a week is a good starting point at 1/3 of the volume that you had, but maintaining as close to intensity as you possibly can.
So, I do have a question about nutrition and calorie output. Like, for example, for me, I know that when I go on a climbing trip, I actually don't move as much as I would during all of my other training phases. And so typically I'm not burning as many calories. And I can feel it, in my body because I'm really like, for me, I'm trying to conserve as much energy for performance as possible. Um, do you have any like recommendations for your athletes for nutrition during a performance phase?
I think the biggest thing is to maintain a high level of intake of vegetables and intake of lean protein. And going back to the precision nutrition recommendations, the palm-sized portion of protein at each meal is a really easy recommendation. And then with cruciferous vegetables, it's a fist-sized portion, and with leafy greens, it would be 2 hands-sized portion. And you want to have one of those at each meal as a minimum. Most athletes would want more like 5 to 6 servings of vegetables in a day. And if we can cover those bases, that's a really good start because typically on the road, we go to more processed foods. We go to eating out more and those sorts of things. So if you can say, my guideline is going to involve 2 servings of vegetables at this meal and a serving of lean protein, and then we can kind of keep ourselves in the optimum recovery zone for going between hard sessions at the crag. And I think that, like you're saying, you may actually not be as hungry because you're not training quite as hard. And so that's something just to monitor, is like paying attention to, am I just overeating because we're sitting around the campfire and there's, a bunch of snacks and things? Or am I avoiding, and this is the problem, am I avoiding finding sources of lean protein in vegetables because it's not convenient? Because it's a lot easier to bring like, mac and cheese camping than it is to bring a bunch of bell peppers. And so I think that a lot of planning is important there. And that's going to be really individual, but paying attention and like writing down, how did I feel? How was my energy at the crag today? What might I do to, to fix this? The big things are, if I'm not feeling like I'm recovering between sessions, increased protein is a good thing. If I'm not feeling like I have enough energy at the crag, increasing the complex carbohydrates I take in while at the crag is going to be really useful.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I kind of have an outlier question here about skill levels. Like if we're talking about maybe a newer climber who's going outside versus an advanced climber going outside. Do you think that there's a difference in what their expectations should be? Do you think there's a difference in even just like physically being able to perform several times a year? Just curious about, like I guess the education in the body, it's different for different people. So yeah, what are your thoughts there?
I think for the first few years that a climber is going on trips and things, trying to aim for a variety of different rock types, different angles, hold types. The whole thing is really critical to the development. And so instead of, say, always going to Joe's in April, you should say, I want to go on bouldering trips, but I want to go to Bishop and to Waco and to Red Rocks and to all of these different places so that I can develop more skills. And at that point, habit would be like, I'm going to go and I want to try to do all of the V2s in this bouldering area today, or all of the V3s, even if they're slabs or weird mantles or whatever, just to develop a bigger book of skills. And then as you become more advanced, you start to, really hone in on, I want to do this project that I've heard a lot about, or I've always wanted to try to, send, a steep route at Waco. And so those sorts of things become more targeted. You might go back to the same area several times, but as a beginner, I think really trying to experience as much about the crag and the style as possible is really important. For us, like a few years ago, Ellen and I took the kids to Fontainebleau, and we wanted to boulder, but the kids were excited and having fun. And so we did one of these super easy circuits of maybe 30 to 40 problems with the kids. Maybe the hardest thing on the whole circuit was V1. But even as we went through this whole circuit, I found myself using weird techniques and strange beta and things like that. And I felt like it was a really developmental time, even though it's quite easy bouldering. And otherwise, if I were on my own, I might have spent the whole day trying to do like a V4 or a V5 and missed out on a lot of what Font had to offer. And so I think that balancing those things out is really important, especially as you're kind of learning who you are as a climber. What are your strengths and weaknesses? What are your preferences? What are your dreams? And that becomes more and more and more critical when you start looking at, what do I really want to get done eventually in my career? But at first, you're just trying to figure that out. It's like your first year of college.
Yeah. And it seems like actually like newer climbers will actually see a steeper I guess improvement ladder. Like they're getting better faster, and then the better you get, this like that slows down significantly, and then you're really trying to squeeze it out as much as you can at the top.
Yeah.
And I guess like you did allude to this, like you going to Fontainebleau, kind of different. You can't always get there. So these new climbing areas for people, there is like the learning curve of that area. And I think that like some people can adapt really well to a new area versus some people, man, it might take them weeks to adapt to that area. To me, that speaks to maybe their ability to adapt, like how well they've been able to train their skill sets. Do you notice a difference in those people? Like if you do compare kind of like the two folks, two groups of people, what do you think kind of distinguishes these two groups?
Well, I think it is. I think there's so much to like this potential for motor learning that's there's a genetic component, there's an experience component. Um, but I think that that's one of the things that if you know that it takes you a long time to adapt to certain areas and you're not really comfortable with different rock types and all that, I think that's an indication that you should do more of it, that you should go to more different areas. But man, the tendency is like, man, I have a hard time adapting to all these different stuff. I'm going to go to the same crag, do the same routes, under the same circumstances with the same partner every single year because it's comfortable for me. But when it comes to developing skill and developing physical ability, stepping outside that comfort zone is really, really important. Um, and we talk about that. There's like being uncomfortable in and of itself is a skill. And people that can go into that uncomfortable zone, whether it's like, you know, body temperature regulation, eating a different ethnicity of diet, or having difficult conversations, those people have a much greater ability to adapt than people that are like, oh, I only eat this food. I always, am at this temperature and I always climb at Maple Canyon, right?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that's really cool. I love the whole concept of skill development and learning to learn as well, like being really open-minded and curious. And I think the folks who are adaptable have more of a curiosity when it comes to anything, really. Um, I lost my train of thought.
Well, that inspired the thought for me, Mercedes, which is that even in a high performance phase, like I have trained for this project, I've thought about this project, I tried it last year, and I'm going to do it again this year. Um, and I'm, say you're going to Leavenworth and you're trying to do, you yourself, you're trying to climb a V12 out there. The other days of the trip, when or later in that day, when things aren't just right for your project, doing anti-style or strange or weird problems that are difficult for you, um, I think that's a totally legitimate use of your time, and it will help keep expanding that comfort zone.
Mhm.
And so I think that's maybe even a critical aspect to a good performance phase, is also addressing skills that are challenging for you on like an off day. We very often will have athletes doing red point days and second tier days. And the second tier day is where we're at a slightly easier grade, but on other climbs or problems that are more difficult for the athlete. And I think that's super useful.
Mm. Yeah, and uh going back to basically the first thing that we were talking about was like expectations. I think it's okay for people who don't adapt to these areas very quickly. It's okay if your body is super stressed out and you can't perform. Again, you have to have this expectation that, hey, you know what? It might not be the best performance, but I'm trying hard and
Yeah.
I'm really believing in the process, and I'm trying to find the things that I find the most fun. Like, where am I finding joy in this performance phase? And that's really like performance is, it should be fun. It should be some element of joy. And I think a lot of people get down on themselves if they're not performing and maybe comparing themselves to other athletes. That performance phase can be really, I don't know, depressing for some folks. I've definitely talked to some athletes who in the past they just haven't had great performance phases.
Yeah.
And I think it again comes all down to expectation and what do you want to achieve? And hopefully it is fun and try hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Viktor Frankl talked about how happiness can't be pursued, it has to ensue. And it's the same thing. You set up all of the conditions for it to happen, and then it comes along quite easily. But the conditions are the crux, right? And
Mm.
those conditions are the things we've talked about, right? Having a good preparation phase, looking at the things that are limiting us, making sure that we're doing things that are goals that are process oriented rather than outcome oriented. And all of that stuff kind of gets put together into this big soup, and then we start to see people send. And the really cool thing is when people do everything right, their performance phases aren't just one 13A red point after many months of trying it. It's lots and lots of hard sends and the ability to on-site better, and this feeling that like, wow, next year's going to be even more amazing. And it's all possible, and it's just a matter of making sure you're not missing one of the specific pieces in there.
Mm. Yeah, and I do wonder about pressure because if you have dedicated, let's say, 3 to 6 months to a preparatory phase and training, and now you're going to go out into a performance phase, and an athlete might put a lot of pressure on themselves. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations? I mean, it sounds like it's the same stuff, like expectations,
Yeah.
setting yourself up right. But what do you say?
Well, when you go to the crag, it's important to think about what are the variables that are under my control, and then I'm going to control those variables. Um, the variables under my control are my attitude toward the climbing. Like I want to go up there and, you know, have a good time and enjoy myself and be proud of my effort, right? And so even if I don't send my project, if I went in there and I did what I intended to do because it's completely under my control, that I tried my hardest, I went for it on the run out section, or I tried the crux 2 new ways, or whatever my intention was leaving the ground. If I follow through on those things, then I'm successful. And again, that's the process oriented stuff, instead of like I'm only going to care if I send. And if I can control those processes, and if I can adhere to following through on the things that I said I would do, then I'm going to continue to keep that cascade towards success going. But I think that's where people get upset, is they put on this pressure of actually seeing the performance, but they don't put pressure on themselves to follow through on, I'm going to try it 3 times today, or I'm going to rest at least 30 minutes between burns today, or I'm going to prepare a really great meal to have at the crag today so my energy stays high. Again, all of these things are completely within your control, and those are the things that we should focus on and have stress about, where the outcome is probably going to come from doing all those other things right, but it's not as important. The thing that you should judge yourself on is, did you follow through on the process oriented goals?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it is the climbers that do really, really well, when you're comparing yourself to them, it might be that you should compare yourself to the things that unseeable,
Mm.
just like we were talking about before. Not just, oh, they're showing up and sending. It's all of actually the other stuff that they're focusing on that's helping them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it is like, if you need to have really perfect conditions, and you need to be, you know, have it just the right light, and, just the right vibe at the crag, and just the right shoes and all the other things, it becomes more and more difficult to find those conditions. And so
Mhm.
part of your training just needs to be banging out some room that you have some variability in the environment in which you can perform. And that's hard. It's not just like doing the workouts and things like that. There's a lot of mental game to that, a lot of tactics and strategies. And it is like behaving the way that a professional behaves. And I'm not talking like a sponsored pro climber, but just the way a person that is a high performer will behave.
Mhm. Ooh, maybe we could talk about complaining a little bit. I like that you brought up conditions. Um, and yes, this happens in a performance phase. Hopefully, you've set up your timing right, that, like temperatures aren't going to be kind of like super crazy. But I see this way too much, is that temperature for boulderers anyway is like a huge limiter for them. Like it does need to be kind of like perfect in order for them to send. And I think that mindset of like always looking for some sort of excuse that's external, I don't know, it's kind of like a cop out in some ways.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
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 Well, Ellen and I love watching World Cup bouldering. And I don't know if you ever listen at the beginning of those, but when they're introduced and they're like, today it's like 94 degrees here in Shanghai, and everybody's getting warmed up and ready to go. And the conditions are often just terrible for indoor bouldering comps. But those people still show up, and they do their very, very best. And here's something that's really interesting is the top performers consistently are the top performers. The same few names end up in finals, and very few of those people are like hopping down and complaining about conditions. They're just like, oh, this is the environment in which I need to perform right now, and I'm gonna go for it. And again, top level climbers. One of the super elites that I'm lucky enough to climb with is a guy named Joel Unuma, and he would love to have better conditions, but he's not going to complain if it's a little too cold or a little too humid. He's like, oh, I got to try it differently because of this. Here are the cards I've been dealt, and I'm going to move forward. Complaining is simply not taking responsibility. You're saying these external conditions free me from having to do my very best at this moment. And so if it's, the weather, if it's the music at the crag, whatever, all of us are subject to those things, but we need to be able to go, you know what, I'm going to take responsibility and try to do my very best in this situation despite these things. And the more that we can just go, this isn't ideal, and we're going to endeavor anyway. I think the stronger we are across the board, because you don't get to pick. If you're on a big wall or if you're on a trip and the conditions are not ideal, you don't get to like go, oh, let's fly back to the United States and come back next week. You just have to do the thing. And so I think it's a really important thing if you find yourself complaining a lot and whining a lot about things, is figuring out a way that you can expand your comfort zone rather than to contract it by making more and more things outside of your control affect the way that you're behaving.
Mm-hmm. And I think, like, just to wrap this episode up, like, it seems like the performance phase, it's 99% mental. Like, that's really, we've done all of the heavy work for training the body, and now the body is basically on autopilot, but the mind really has to take over and get you through this performance phase. And yeah, it's being able to endure any obstacle that comes your way. And a lot of the time it's ourselves that gets in the way.
For sure. And we've got some really high stress situations in climbing. We're facing falling off a cliff, as the result of failure. And very rarely do people get hurt on big bouldering falls or sport climbing falls, but those things are no less scary. We have a lot of pressure. If it's a big bouldering scramble, there can be 200 people watching us do a boulder problem. And so these are high pressure situations. And I think that one of the biggest things with the performance phase is understanding that that's a big part of it. And that needs to be part of the way that we show up for it. Yes, it's awesome to have strong fingers, but unless we're prepared mentally, it's still going to be really challenging for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're wrapping this up. Was there any other thoughts that you had around a performance phase that we didn't quite get to or talk about?
I think the final thing, Mercedes, is understanding when a performance phase is coming to an end. And that tends to be when performance levels off, when we start getting like these niggling little injuries, or when we're just a little bit less psyched. You're like kind of going, oh, I don't really feel like going out today. It's okay if the phase ends a lot faster than you thought. If you're like, wait, I had a whole nother month planned out in my schedule for this. The number one thing is immediately step back and take a deload week and just kind of take it easy. And then toward the end of that week, come into it and say, okay, am I ready to go back into performance, or do I still need to deload a little bit? And if you get to the end of a first deload week and you're feeling like you need a second one, that's when I just say the phase is over. We take that second deload week and spend some time planning how to rebuild. And you start building back in after that into another strength and power phase. And then we start into the next season. And you might have an extended training phase at the end of a particularly bad performance phase, but that's okay. We just have to have some variability and understand that we're biological, we're not spreadsheets. And so when it's time to rest, there's no amount of motivation or numbers on a computer screen that are going to change the way that our body has responded to that particular training.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for your time again today. And we'll catch you in the next one. Thanks, Steve.
Awesome. Sounds good. I'll talk to you
Yeah.
soon.
Okay.